What I have for you here is the fruit of 2 weeks' work on an unexpected treat. One of those late-in-life discoveries that makes one wonder how one could have lived so many years without ever having heard of its creator. A few weeks ago, my geographically distant friend Ivan Garcia asked me if I was acquainted with the music of his countryman, Juan Crisóstomo Arriaga, born in January 1806, died just shy of his 20th birthday, over a year before Beethoven shuffled off his own mortal coil. He's nicknamed the Spanish Mozart, although the one symphony he wrote, the D minor miracle I'm about to present for your consideration, doesn't sound at all like Mozart. The Mozart comparison is owing to Arriaga's prodigious childhood and his lamentably early death. Although there are certainly turns of phrase in this music that have a kind of Mozartian grace, Arriaga reminds me much more of Franz Schubert, and even more yet, oddly enough perhaps, of the relatively obscure Swedish composer Franz Berwald, Arriaga's slightly older contemporary who outlived the young Basque Spaniard by the better part of half a century. Arriaga was 17 years old when he wrote his D minor symphony, and it is, of course, certainly the case that had he lived a reasonable number of years, even as many as Mozart's 35, or better yet, Beethoven's 56, this symphony would, in retrospect, have been counted among his juvenilia. As it is, here is this one lustrous, gem-like work that might have foreshadowed any number of compositional adventures whose nature we can only guess at. Could anyone have predicted Beethoven's ninth from hearing his first, written a quarter of a century earlier? What you will hear in this video is the budding germ of an astonishing compositional talent struck down before it was able to mature. There's no calculating the loss this represents. Arriaga's one symphony is a paradigm of the musical world the composer was born into. A classical world both enriched and challenged by the romantic impulse that sought to make of music a species of literature. That is the historical demon that drove Beethoven and Schubert, different as their journeys turned out to be, and it would doubtless have been Arriaga's reality as well, as this symphony demonstrates clearly. This is obviously the work of a musical classicist. His themes, although reeled out in paragraphs of sometimes extraordinary length, are all in the right keys and behave in the right ways vis-a-vis each other. Most of them are periodic in the tidiest sense, and there are simply no formal surprises. The final movement's recapitulation is probably the most regular you'll ever hear, bordering on the literal, except for the adjustments that sonata principles call for. But those themes are also mostly song-like, quite different from the contrapuntal contraptions of Haydn and Beethoven, and often of a brooding quality, a hallmark of 19th century Romanticism. Perhaps following Beethoven's lead, Arriaga entitled his masterpiece a Symphony for Large Orchestra. Beethoven assigned the number 1 to his first symphony only after he had written a second, which is, of course, a prudent thing to do. In the sad case of the younger composer, there was to be no second. To clarify, in Arriaga's time, large orchestra was the usual designation for an ensemble that included pairs of flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets, and drums, and enough strings to balance that noisy group. Arriaga's use of the orchestra is quite conservative. comparable to Beethoven's in his first, compared to a more extravagant deployment of orchestral forces in later symphonies. The formal feature of this symphony that practically defines it for me is this: all four movements are thoroughly informed by the sonata principle, with three of them being well-behaved, clear-cut examples of the use of sonata form, regular enough in all respects to furnish textbook paradigms, and three of those movements are wonderful illustrations of how elastic sonata form is in its ability to accommodate themes and functional passages of extraordinary length while retaining the agreeable proportions called for by the classical ideal. The movements I've just described are the first, second, and fourth, all of which include themes of rare beauty, those themes perfectly turned out, generally as ample parallel periods. And as if to reawaken the listener to an alternative way of employing the sonata principle, in case the first two movements have lulled said listener into a comfortable expectation that this Schubertian approach will continue, the minuet sets forth a stark alternative, which I'll describe when its time comes round. I think it best to introduce the movements individually in this case. First, an acknowledgement and a comment thereon are in order. The recording you'll hear is by the early music ensemble Il Fondamento, conducted by Paul Dombrecht. There are other recordings of this symphony that can be heard on YouTube, including two by Jesus Lopez Cobos. I'm very grateful for the permission to use the recording I'm using, but I much prefer Lopez Cobos's reading of this symphony. Its more generous pace, the sound of an orchestra unashamed to give free rein to the vibrato impulse and sing these singable themes, the modern tuning standard. The only reason I'm not using one of those recordings instead of the one I have used is that Lopez Cobos takes a large cut in the opening movement. What he omits is the entire antecedent paragraph of the first theme. I devoutly wish he hadn't done that. He did not thereby improve the symphony. The first movement opens in D major, an unusual way to begin a symphony whose outer movements otherwise behave exactly as we would expect such movements in a D minor symphony to behave, with one of the most generous and protracted introductory paragraphs you'll ever hear. Arriaga might have heard a model in a performance of Mozart's Prague Symphony. Surely that work was known to him. Beethoven's distillation of that introduction in his own Second Symphony might likewise have suggested the approach Arriaga takes here, with a bright heraldic opening soon giving way to strange musings that eventually land the music in the parallel minor to set the stage for the movement's exposition. The difference is, of course, that those imposing D major to D minor introductions in Mozart and Beethoven yield to primary themes in D major, while Arriaga is going to continue in the minor mode. And he does so with a stormy opening theme, almost operatic in character, set forth in the kind of expanded periodic structure that I alluded to earlier. Both of its paragraphs include passages constructed of a swinging triadic motive in upward chromatic sequence, to which I've called your attention. You might want to notice this, as a rhythmically adjusted inversion of this motive supplies the material for the first part of the development section, and a splendidly transformed version becomes the basis of a new closing theme during the recapitulation. That's a lot to digest, I know. The transition is correspondingly generous in length, and it sets up a second group that begins with a bright, cheerful, arching plein air tune, answered forthwith by a parallel minor rejoinder that calls that brightness into question. the first of a number of challenges, most of them fleeting, to the mostly bright modality of this F major second group. That seems to me significant. The first part of the development is occupied with the treatment of an apparently new motive that is in fact an inversion and rhythmic adjustment of the swinging motive in rising sequence that you heard during theme 1A. This treatment, unsurprisingly, takes the shape of a new theme in A-A-B-A form. That's a surefire sign that the composer is a songbird at heart. Again, a Schubertian trait. The development's second half is a B-flat major treatment of the second theme that soon slips into D minor for a retransition that includes the introductory lead-in that has already twice served the first theme well. The return is abbreviated, beginning with the first theme's consequent paragraph. The transition stays put, and the previously bright, sunny, open-air theme is reborn in a gloomy cloak of D minor. A new closing theme, based on the first theme's swinging triads, injects a final dose of major-minor ambiguity, and the movement closes with a dark tempo presto coda, with the development's apparent new motive compressed almost to the fusing point. Any residual doubt as to the primary modality of this symphony is surely laid to rest by now. Movement 2 is an A major tropic of sheer loveliness, a sonata form movement of extraordinary breadth and vastness and rare beauty. Its first theme, an expansive paragraph with the character of a solemn processional alternating between austere unison and plenteous harmony, is laid out for us twice in a sense, and there is much to savor in it. The brief modulating transition begins with a little yelp of pain, but soon melts into E major for one of the most beautiful themes I have ever heard or can ever hope to hear. I'll say no more about it. Even the most well-intentioned words I could summon would run the risk of cheapening something that seems dropped from heaven. The development section gives vent to some doubts and anxieties, perhaps serving as a stern reminder that not all is as paradisical as this movement's music so far might have suggested. But even in the midst of this unsettled outpouring, there lies the most luminous music of this movement, a D major return of the solemn opening phrase initially sung in unison, now garbed in the fullness of warmth that only generous diatonic harmony can confer. It is a rare gem of a moment, a musical beacon in the night. The recapitulation is regular, with a reduction in the first theme, and the music ends quietly and at peace. I've already said a few words about the D major minuet, whose main submovement is in highest contrast to what you've heard so far, surely the most dense, most compact sonata form structure I've ever encountered. Its jagged polyphonic themes racing by at breathless pace and spending themselves forthwith, and functional passages reduced to almost nothing. And in what is, in its quiet way, the most extravagant gesture of the entire symphony, Arriaga brushes aside that bristling minuet for a quiet trio in repeated strains for solo flute and subtle accompaniment, a place to catch one's breath and relax, to get one's heart rate back to normal and enjoy the pleasant vistas and birdsong and some of the most charming music you'll ever hear before that blustering syncopated minuet roils the waters again with its da capo reprise. This is an amazing movement and by far the shortest of the piece. The fleet-footed final movement is the only one with an exposition repeat, and it begins with its gearbox fully engaged, with an arching tune in apparent compound time. Arriaga's bent to long paragraphs is once again in evidence here. A stormy transition eventually conveys the music away from its tonic key and with some struggle wins the mediant, where another vaultingly beautiful theme unfolds. As in Movement 1, parallel minor challenges soon interrupt the serenity, and the exposition ends in a somewhat unsettled condition. It is, as I've indicated, repeated. The brief development is yet another stretch of troubled waters, and the first theme returns at the recap in its original condition. I mentioned earlier that this recapitulation is utterly regular, meaning that all the music presented earlier in F major and allied keys is now heard in D major et al. This represents two time-honored expectations regarding the endings of minor key symphonies: that the tonal center of both the first and second subjects will be one and the same during the return, and that the previously relative major key group will be heard now in the major mode in the parallel key, provided the intent is to convey a sense of some kind of struggle having been won. I assume that what I've just said about this major key ending, vague as it is, will, on account of that very vagueness, not misrepresent the composer's intended meaning. I plan to spend some time with this composer during the coming weeks, likely beginning with his 3 string quartets.